The history of money is far more interesting than most people would first expect. It's a story filled with mystery, betrayal, a lot of poor decisions, and entire civilizations all agreeing to believe in the completely made up thing that is money. And just to show you how weird and strange money really is, there's a story that goes like this. It's a slow day in a little town. The streets are deserted, times are tough, everyone's in debt, and everyone lives on credit. On this particular day, a rich tourist from back west is driving through town. He stops at the hotel and lays a $100 bill on the desk, saying he wants to inspect the rooms upstairs in order to pick one to spend the night. As soon as the man walks upstairs, the owner grabs the bill and runs next door to pay his debt to the butcher. The butcher takes the $100 and runs down the street to pay his debt to the pig farmer. The pig farmer then takes his $100 bill and heads off to pay his bill at the feed store. The guy at the feed store then takes the $100 and runs to pay his debt to the local carpenter. The carpenter in turn rushes back to the motel and pays off his debt with the motel owner. The motel proprietor now places the $100 bill back on the counter so the rich traveler will not suspect anything. At that moment, the traveler comes down the stairs, picks up the $100 bill, states that the rooms are not satisfactory, pockets the money, and leaves. Now, nobody produced anything and nobody earned anything. However, now the entire town is out of debt. How exactly is that possible? And is money even what we think it is? So here's the entire history of money in less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee. The origins of money are commonly thought to have come from barter. AKA, you have 5 sheep I want, I have 10 wheat you want, let's make a trade. It makes sense that's how money would have started, right? The only problem is, it's a complete myth. There's actually no proof that barter was ever used historically before money. The myth of barter comes from this guy named Adam Smith, who theorized that money was invented as a way to make barter easier. But anthropologists who have traveled and studied undeveloped parts of the globe for centuries have never once come across the culture actually using barter before money was introduced. And on top of that, there's zero evidence of barter existing historically. AKA, barter as the origins of money is actually just a myth. So if money didn't come from barter, then where did it come from? Money actually came into existence because of debt. You see, early civilizations were small, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone. And when someone needed something, you would help them, knowing that you might need help tomorrow. Keep in mind, back then, people had to rely on each other to survive. And as societies began growing and small villages became bigger and bigger, relationships became less personal, and now not everyone knew everyone else. So now, if you needed a bunch of grain and your neighbor couldn't lend you some, you might go into the village and find someone you don't know and ask them for the grain. And if they recognized your name and you had a strong and trustworthy reputation, then you'd have an easier ability of actually getting them to lend you the grain. And as these societies grew and these sort of relationships like this became more and more complex, it became hard to keep track of. You might have lent out some sheep to Farmer Dave, you might have lent out some apples to Farmer John, you might have lent out some wheat to Farmer Rick, and as you can imagine, it can get tiresome trying to keep track of all that debt mentally year over year. So over time, as these systems became more and more complex, official records of debit and credit were created to keep track of who owed what and how much they owed. And this system was in many ways the birth of money. And as societies kept growing and becoming more and more complex, they came up with new, innovative, and far more efficient ways to keep track of this debt. Some societies would use tally sticks, some would use rocks, some would use rare metals, and some would use seashells. And these objects came to signify the debt that you owed somebody. You might borrow a pig from Dave and give him 10 rare seashells as a form of an IOU. This made it far more easy and efficient to keep track of debt because now you didn't have to have a pen, you didn't have to have ink, you didn't have to know how to write. You could just give him some seashells and that was your IOU. And over time, as these societies grew more and more complex and these relationships grew less and less personal, people began taking these seashells and these rare metals and these items that they were, using to signify this debt, and they began trading around each other's debts. So if Dave owes me a pig and had given me 10 seashells and I want your sheep, I might give you those 10 seashells in exchange for your sheep, and then you'll later down the line take those 10 seashells and trade them back to Dave in exchange for a pig or, maybe whatever else you want. And all this kept growing until around 550 BC, when the Greeks finally invented the world's first coins, a standardized unit of exchange backed by the government. Now imagine you're the Greek government and you need to hire some troops, or maybe you need to hire some mercenaries. Well, money doesn't exist, so how do you convince these people to come work for you? That was the problem the Greek government was facing at the time, and they came up with this idea. They would fund these wars and expansions through essentially an IOU issued by the government. So the government took a bunch of this rare metal that they had, made it a standard size and shape, and put an insignia on it, creating these government IOUs, which were the world's first coins. The government then did something really smart. They started requiring all citizens to pay their taxes in this new form of government IOU. This created demand for people to acquire these coins over time, and these new coins ended up transforming Greece. Suddenly, people started making things and trying to sell them, trying to earn more of these coins. And entire marketplaces started springing up where people could buy pigs, or pots, or fabric, or spices. No longer were people restricted to just having to farm. They could provide a service or a product or whatever else thing that people were willing to trade their coins for. And suddenly, poor farmers could become wealthy merchants. People had more freedom and the ability to choose the life they wanted to live. And in general, the quality of life for almost everyone ended up going up. And because of this, the concept of these coin IOUs, this coin money, ended up spreading like a wildfire all over the world over the coming centuries. Now fast forward to around 1200 AD, a guy named Marco Polo goes to Asia for about 25 years and comes back with some crazy outlandish stories that he tells in this book he wrote. And in chapter 24 of the book, he starts it out by saying this: "Foretell it how I might, you never would be satisfied that I was keeping within truth and reason." AKA, what I'm about to tell you is so insane, so crazy, so mind-blowing that I guarantee none of you are gonna believe it. And then he went on to describe a form of money that wasn't made from gold, it wasn't made from silver, but it was made out of everyday common paper. He said in China, they had figured out a way to turn paper into money. And what ended up happening is nobody believed him. They thought he was lying because it seemed too absurd and too ridiculous to be possible. But he wasn't lying. It was true. China had invented paper money, and they did it about 1,000 years before anyone else would. China, like the rest of the world, had discovered the radical innovation that is coins. And in China, they mostly made their coins out of bronze. But in the province of Sichuan, they didn't have enough bronze to actually make coins out of, so they made them out of iron instead. Now, a coin's value was based on the metal it was made out of. And iron, being not that insanely valuable, ended up being a horrible thing to use as money. If you went to the market to buy a pound of salt, you would have to bring with you 1.5 pounds of iron coins. And as you can imagine, this wasn't super convenient when trying to go to the market and buy things. So around 995 AD, a merchant in Sichuan had a genius business idea. He would let people leave their heavy coins with him, and in exchange, they get a paper receipt. These receipts were transferable, and anyone with the receipt could come back and claim those coins. This service soon took off, and people, rather than lugging around these heavy coins, began trading these paper receipts to buy things instead, using them as a form of money. It was a huge hit, and paper money was born. Unfortunately, soon after this, some people realized that it was just paper with writing on it, and they could just take their own paper and write on it. And so all these counterfeit paper receipts started popping up. People would take these receipts and they would go back to the bank to try to claim their iron coins, and they'd find out they're fake. And it ended up being a huge, massive mess to where the government eventually stepped in and said, hey, we're gonna take control of this paper money. And because this paper money was much lighter, much easier to move around, and was much easier to transport, it ended up revolutionizing China. New technologies were invented, new trade, more efficient farming practices. And even at one point, Sichuan had a restaurant scene of all these hip restaurants that was really similar to what we might experience today. China became richer and richer, people lived happier lives, people had more freedom, the quality of life for everyone improved, and China became one of the most technologically advanced civilizations on the planet. Unfortunately, a couple hundred years later, a new ruler took over who wanted to take China back to its roots. He hated all the innovations and all the money and what it had done to China. He banned trade trade got rid of paper money, and by 1500 AD, paper money had completely disappeared from China. And it wasn't until almost 1,000 years after China had discovered paper money that the Western world ended up discovering it as well. The King of England really needed some money, so England came up with this idea for this revolutionary new thing called a bank. The basic idea was that people throughout England could buy shares in this bank. In the same way that you might buy shares in a stock, people throughout England could buy shares in this bank. And keep in mind, again, paper money doesn't exist in England at this point. So when people are buying shares, they're taking their gold, they're taking their silver, they're giving it to this bank, and the bank is then holding all these gold and silver coins. The bank then takes this money and lends it out to the king. And in exchange, the king promises to pay back the money he's borrowed with interest. So the king's able to raise a ton of money, and these people that are buying these shares are gonna get paid interest, so they're gonna hopefully make a ton of money. But the way that they set up the loan to this king was really interesting. Instead of physically giving him all this gold and silver, they gave him paper receipts that were redeemable for the gold and silver, which is exactly how paper money started in China. Soon, other countries like France created a similar system, only instead of just the king getting these paper receipts, they allowed the everyday average person to deposit gold and silver into the bank, and in exchange, they could get paper receipts that were redeemable for their gold and silver. These receipts became their own version of paper money, and it was China all over again. And this kicked off a new era of paper money that slowly spread all over the world. And at the start, a good amount of these banks issuing this paper money were actually private banks. It was really similar to how they'd done it in China, where it was just this merchant who decided to, offer this service. But eventually, over time, governments did step in. They created their own central banks that were responsible for the creation of this new paper money. With the notable and kind of strange exception of the United States, which did something radically different known as free banking, where essentially anyone who followed a standard set of rules could create their own bank and print their own currency. This led to, at one point, according to the Chicago Tribune, there being over 8,370 different kinds of paper money circulating around the United States. And as you can imagine, this was incredibly confusing. You would go to pay for whatever goods you were trying to buy with this paper money, but some of it was from New York, some of it was from Florida, some of it was from Mississippi, and all these bills were wildly different. And maybe this merchant has never seen some of these bills, so they'd have to pull out this giant encyclopedia and they look for the description of the bill that you had given them, and they'd have to look it up and look for the special markings to see if it was real or just a counterfeit. And this became a real issue. With 8,370 different kinds of currency, counterfeits ran rampant. Lots of banks printed way more paper notes than they actually had assets to back up those paper notes with. And there was a lot of chaos going on, with tons of banks just utterly collapsing. And back then, when a bank collapsed and you had your money in it, you would just lose all your money. Like, there was no way to get that money back. If the bank went under and you had your money deposited there, now you had no money. And during all this, some of the most powerful bankers in the US secretly, like in the dead of night, snuck onto this train, went down to this crazy place called Jekyll Island, and in total secrecy hatched a plan to create a central bank to fix all these issues. They called this central bank the Reserve Association of the United States. Later though, they changed the name to the Federal Reserve Banks. And after some scheming and plotting in Washington, they were able to successfully launch this US central bank that ended up being like this hybrid private government entity that was controlled by the United States, but also kind of private as well. And with this new central bank came a new central currency that was backed by the United States called the US dollar. And it's important to note that up until this point in history, paper money has always still kind of maintained this role as sort of like a receipt for actual gold in the bank. So people would deposit their gold coins into a bank, and in exchange for these gold coins, they would get a receipt. That was the paper money. That was the role of paper money. It was, hey, this is a placeholder for this gold that's actually sitting in the bank. And at first it worked, but over time the bank's policies became looser and more irresponsible, where they'd actually take customer funds that were deposited, say Jim deposits 1,000 gold pieces, they'd take 900 of those gold pieces and lend those out to Bob. And so if Jim came back for his 1,000 gold pieces, well, they weren't there. So they would have to shuffle money from somebody else's account over to Jim's account so Jim could withdraw his gold pieces. And And this worked as long as everyone didn't come try to withdraw all their money at the same time. It's really kind of like a giant Ponzi scheme, only it was a legal Ponzi scheme because that's how banks are still currently run to this day. And usually this would work, but occasionally rumors would spread and people would get fearful and they all would try to come withdraw their money at the same time. And this would usually cause the bank to collapse and everyone would lose their money and it was a horrible big ordeal. But again, these were private banks, so that was that. But in 1931, the Bank of England was facing a similar scenario. People wanted their gold and they didn't have it. So they ended up making a really simple, really crazy, really insane decision, which was they were no longer going to allow people to redeem their money for gold. Basically what they said is like, hey, you know, this money, this paper money, it's still backed by gold, but you can no longer redeem it for gold. Like the gold's in the vault, you just know it's there, but you can no longer take your paper money and actually go exchange that paper money for the gold. And this ended up solving all of Bank of England's problems. And later, in around 1933, the US, seeing that this has worked out so well for England and also facing similar issues, decided to do the same thing, making it so that average everyday people could no longer go exchange their paper notes for the gold that was supposed to back it. But again, at this point, they were still saying that the money was backed by gold. The gold was in the vault. You just couldn't redeem the gold, but it was still there. It was still, you know, a note that represented that gold in the vault. It's also important to note that although the average everyday American couldn't go take their money and redeem it for gold, other nations outside the US who held US dollars could still come to the US and redeem their money for gold. As you can imagine, now that the bank didn't have to worry about people coming and trying to claim the gold that they were supposed to have, the bank over time could get away with holding less and less gold to actually back these dollars. And then in 1971, they faced this big issue where like another country wanted to come redeem their US dollars for gold. They didn't have the gold, so they decided to completely remove the US dollar from the gold standard, creating a new paper money that was backed by nothing. And at this point, it's important to note that after World War II, the world was reeling, a lot of countries were in debt, and they decided to create this new global financial system. And at the center of this new global financial system, they decided that the US dollar should become the world's reserve currency, making it so that the US dollar was the uniform unit of measure when paying back debts. And the reason this is important to highlight is after 1971, with paper money no longer having to be backed by gold, the US government was now freed up to print as much money as they saw fit. And as the world's reserve currency, it literally meant they could pay off their own debts with their own money that they printed. It's kind of like playing a game of Monopoly, where everyone else has to play by the rules, but you're allowed to take as much money as you want from the bank anytime during the game, as many times as you want. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility. The government knew that, and they decided to do the right thing, not print a bunch of money, not to go into massive debt, but to be fiscally responsible because that is the ethical and good and American thing to do. Just kidding, that's not at all what the government did. The government decided that debt didn't matter and that they could just print as much money as they wanted, essentially allowing the American economy to grow endlessly on credit, which led America to create the biggest debt bubble in all of history. And finally, this all leads to 2008, where an anonymous coder by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto creates a new kind of money that's not seashells or coins or paper, but it's purely digital. A new kind of money that you can actually carry around in your head and you don't have to hold physically at all. It was called Bitcoin, and it was a type of money that didn't require you to trust banks to hold deposits on hand or you to trust governments to hold gold. Scarcity was programmed into the currency and it couldn't be manipulated by banks or governments. In fact, if you memorize an 8-word seed phrase, you could literally hold millions of dollars in your head. You could cross borders and go in and out of countries and no government or person on the planet could confiscate that money from you. I don't know if Bitcoin really is the next wave of how money is going to work, but one thing you can see throughout history is money slowly improves and becomes more efficient over time. And that's it. That's the entire history of money in a nutshell. And I hope you learned something. I hope that helps you understand finance a little bit deeper and the way that our world works. If you have any questions or comments or anything to add, let me know down in the comments below. If this video is helpful, make sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button, as well as you got to hit the little bell next to it if you want to actually be notified each time I release a video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.